like I said, my name is James, and tonight we're talking about the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And really, the resurrection is at the heart of the gospel message. Paul was very clear about this. He said in 1 Corinthians 15:14, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." So the resurrection is at the heart of the very message that we're supposed to go out and share with the entire world. That's easier said than done, right? Sharing the gospel message with the entire world. I mean, often it's hard enough sharing the gospel message just right here in our own community, in our own culture. And one reason for that some of you have heard me talk about before, is that we live in a very skeptical culture. We live in an incredibly skeptical culture. Some of you have heard me say that in our culture, when you say to someone, Jesus loves you, Jesus died for you, and you can know Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, by the time it's filtered through the skeptical mind of our culture, you know what they hear? Peter Pan loves you. Peter Pan died for you, and you can know Peter Pan as your personal Lord and Savior. That's really how they hear it. They hear it as a fairy tale. And really, I'm not sure we can blame people too much for hearing the gospel message as a fairy tale in our culture. I'm not sure we can blame people too much because, if you think about it, Jesus made some very radical claims. He made some incredibly radical claims. He claimed to be the unique messenger of God. He claimed to be the only way to God. And he claimed to be God himself. I mean, imagine if you go into work tomorrow and, Milton from accounting, he comes over and he says, just wanted you to know, I'm the unique messenger of God. I'm the only way to God, and oh, by the way, I'm God himself. I think we'd be thinking, man, this guy's been sniffing a little too much whiteout. Like, he's lost his marbles. So we laugh at someone who makes those kind of claims today. So can we blame people for hearing the gospel message as a fairy tale today? In fact, even in Jesus' own culture, the people right around him, they responded to him in much the same way. Jesus' own critics said to him, "Oh yeah? You think you're the only way to God? You think you're God himself? Why don't you prove it to us? Why don't you give us some kind of sign?" Well, he said he would give them a sign. In fact, he said he'd give us the ultimate sign. He would die, and 3 days later he would rise from the dead. It's an incredible proof for an incredible claim. And it's a good thing we have that incredible proof, because Jesus is not the only person in history to have made radical claims. Buddha made some pretty radical claims. Joseph Smith made some radical claims. Muhammad made some very radical claims. So we need to realize that we as Christians, we're not the only vendors in the marketplace of ideas. But of course, the important question is not, did Jesus make radical claims? Of course he did, and others have made radical claims. The important question is, what reason is there to believe the claims of Jesus of Nazareth over and above these others? So basically what I'm asking is, where's the evidence? Well, we're going to look at the evidence. Now, in giving evidence for the resurrection, there are actually several approaches that we can take. I could give evidence, for example, that the Bible is divinely inspired. Basically, that the Bible is a message from God to man, rather than simply a message written by man about God. And I think we have an incredible amount of evidence that the Bible really is a message from God. In fact, some of you may have heard me do the presentation where I give the evidence that the Bible is a message from God. And I think we have an incredible amount of evidence. And if we can show that the Bible really is from God, then it's a short step from that to showing that the resurrection happened. Basically, we wouldn't expect God to get his history wrong. So if the Bible is a message from God, it says Jesus rose from the dead, we have good reason to trust that. But that's not the approach we're taking here this evening. Now, I could also give evidence that the Bible is historically reliable. I think we have a lot of evidence, again, that the Bible is historically reliable. And if we can show, and some of you have heard, I don't know, Ernest, if you've heard me, but I've done presentations on the evidence that the Bible is historically reliable. There's a presentation I do on the evidence for the New Testament, and then we've seen videos, there are documentaries about the historical evidence for the Old Testament. And if we can show that the Old and New Testament are historically reliable, even just in general, even if just for the most part they're historically reliable, well then our case is pretty much made that the resurrection happened. Because if the Bible generally gets its historical details right, and then it says that Jesus rose from the dead, well, we have good reason to trust that Jesus really did rise from the dead. that's not the approach we're taking here this evening either. In fact, tonight we're going to be assuming that the Bible is written by ordinary, fallible people. No divine help at all. In fact, we're even going to be assuming that the Bible contains historical errors. Now, I don't actually think that the Bible does contain historical errors. I think the alleged historical errors that many skeptics and atheists bring up are actually full of problems. When you start to look into them, they fall apart. But, for the sake of argument here this evening, we're just going to assume, sure, the Bible contains some historical errors. And we're even going to be assuming that the Bible contains contradictions. Now, again, I don't actually think that the Bible does contain legitimate contradictions. I think that the alleged contradictions that are often raised against the Bible, when you actually compare the two verses that are supposed to be in contradiction, and you pay attention to the context and what the author intended to say, well, it turns out these two verses don't actually contradict each other. But, for the sake of argument here this evening, we'll just assume, sure, the Bible contains some contradictions. And still, we can historically prove the resurrection. We can demonstrate historically that we have good reason to think that the resurrection happened. That's how good the evidence is. We don't need divine authorship. We don't need historical reliability. We can even assume that the Bible is written by ordinary, fallible people, and still we can demonstrate the resurrection historically. And you might be wondering, James, how are you going to prove the resurrection when you're basically assuming that the Bible is a flawed document? I mean, now you're stuck with a flawed document, so how are we going to prove the resurrection? Well, tonight, we're going to use the tools of the historian. We're going to use standard historical methods. Because, think about it, the historian is always stuck with sources that are written by ordinary, fallible people. And so what the historian has to do is they have to then look at their sources and separate out those statements in their sources that they have good reason to think are historically accurate, and then leave behind everything else. Now, please understand me, I'm not saying that the historian looks at their sources and separates out historical fact, and then everything else must be fiction, or must be, myth, or something like that. No, what the historian is trying to do is something much more simple. They simply look at their sources, and anything they have good reason, any statement they have good reason to think is historically accurate, they set that aside, and everything else they just don't know about. They're just not making a judgment at that time. Now, sure, there are times where the historian does have enough information to judge that a certain statement in one of their sources is myth or is fabricated or something like that. In fact, sometimes they can even tell that an entire source, an entire document is fabricated or myth or something like that. But typically what the historian is doing is something very simple. They just separate out those statements they have good reason to think are accurate, and everything else is just a question mark. So, how does the historian determine what statements are historically accurate? Well, there's one main tool that the historian uses. There are actually several others, and in your packet I've put a list of several other tools that the historian uses. But there's one main tool. The historian is looking for multiple independent accounts that agree. It's kind of like in a court of law. If you have multiple witnesses that all agree that a certain event happened, then you've got a pretty strong case. Like, let me give you an illustration. Let's suppose we're all in a courtroom here, and you guys are in the audience, and a witness takes the stand. And the witness says, yes, Your Honor, I was shopping at Macy's on November 1st, 2017. It was about 10 a.m. I was on the second floor in the home appliance section, and I witnessed Ernest Hirata take a red spatula, stick it into his backpack, and he walked out the door. Oh, man. Then a second witness takes the stand and says, yes, Your Honor, I was shopping at Macy's. It was November 1st, 2017. It was about 10 a.m. I was on the second floor in the home appliance section, and I saw Ernest Hirata take a red spatula and a whisk, stuck it into his backpack, and went out the door. Wow. Then a third witness takes the stand and says, yes, Your Honor, I was shopping at Macy's November 1st, 2017. It was about 10 a.m. I was on the first floor near the registers, and I witnessed Ernest Hirata take a red spatula. He stuck it in his backpack and walked out the door. Wow. So now you're thinking, man, Ernest goes to my church. That's crazy. He must steal that stuff and then go to church on Sunday morning. That's crazy. What a lunatic. No, just kidding. After you have that thought, then you're thinking, okay, we have three witnesses, right? Now, does the testimony of all three witnesses agree? No, there's some contradictions between their testimony. In fact, there's probably even an historical error here, because two people said it happened on the second floor, and one person said it happened on the first floor. But can we establish that Ernest did in fact take the red spatula? Yeah, I think we've got a pretty strong case. Now, can we establish that he took the whisk? No, it's a little more sketchy, right? I mean, we wouldn't put it past him. But no, I'm sorry, no. Those of you who know Ernest, you know he takes kitchen appliances all the time. It's everything he does. Anyway, the point is, sorry, just kidding. The point is that we can at least establish the red spatula, right? So this is the kind of evidence that the historian is looking for. Multiple independent accounts that agree. So how does this actually apply to the Bible? Well, with the Bible, we don't just have one book, right? It's not just one historical source. Instead, the Bible is a collection of accounts and letters and other types of writings written by many different authors coming from many different perspectives. And with the New Testament in particular, again, it's a collection of accounts and letters and other types of writings written by many different authors coming from many different perspectives, all written within the first century. And so it's going to be useful in comparing these accounts to see if we have multiple independent accounts that agree. And because we're not assuming that every statement in the New Testament is just automatically historically reliable, we're going to be separating certain statements out of the New Testament. And so we're going to have a group of facts, but we're not going to have the whole narrative. We're going to be taking out just parts of the narrative. But you see, this is typical in studying history. The historian typically doesn't have the whole picture. Instead, they just have pieces of the puzzle. And so what the historian has to do is then try to develop a theory that adequately explains the pieces that they have. It's kind of like this illustration. If you have certain pieces of a puzzle, you can look at different box tops and see which box top or which overall explanation accounts for all the pieces that you have. And so that's what the historian tries to do. So with the resurrection, we're going to look at the New Testament, and then using the tools of the historian, we're going to separate out certain statements out of the New Testament and leave behind the rest, and then see if there's a theory that adequately explains the pieces that we have, explains the evidence that we have. So what kind of historical facts can we establish using the tools of the historian when we look at the New Testament? Well, it turns out there are a tremendous number of historical facts that we can establish in the New Testament relating to the resurrection when we use the tools of the historian. In fact, there are so many, we just don't have time to cover them all here this evening. So we're going to limit the evidence we use even further. We're going to limit the evidence we use further. We're only going to rely upon those facts that are agreed upon by the majority of New Testament historians, both liberal and conservative. Only those facts that are agreed upon by the majority of New Testament historians. At this point, you might wonder, James, how do you know what the majority of New Testament historians agree upon? Have you surveyed the writings of all of these historians? No, I haven't. But fortunately for us, there is someone who has. And that would be Dr. Gary Habermas. Dr. Habermas is a world-renowned expert in the historicity of the resurrection. And he's written many, many books. Like you guys have heard of the Da Vinci Code? Yeah, he didn't write that. But he wrote a bunch of other books. He responded to the Da Vinci Code, right? So that kind of counts. But anyway, the point is he wrote a bunch of books on the historical evidence for the resurrection. And he surveyed the writings of over 1,200 New Testament historians, writing in several different languages. And what he found is that there are at least 12 facts that are agreed upon by the majority of these historians. And in fact, we're not even going to look at all 12 facts. We're going to focus in on 4 of those that he typically focuses in on when he does a shorter presentation. Now keep in mind that many, if not most of these scholars that he surveyed are critical of biblical Christianity. These are not what you'd call conservative Christian scholars, for the most part. But still, he argues for the historicity of the resurrection using these 4 facts that are agreed upon by these scholars. And he calls this, by the majority of the scholars, and he calls this the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. And so the 4 facts that we're going to look at are, number 1, Jesus did die. We can know historically that Jesus did die on the Roman cross. Number 2, Jesus' tomb was found empty on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion. Number 3, the disciples and others experienced appearances of the risen Jesus. And number 4, the lives of the disciples and even enemies of Jesus were radically transformed following this alleged resurrection. Now, I don't want to just teach you these 4 facts and just leave it at that. I want to equip you guys with the tools you need so you can remember these 4 facts just right off the top of your head. So that when you're talking to someone and you want to share the evidence for the resurrection, you can just remember these facts off the top of your head. So we're going to use a memorization tool. We're going to use the word feet, F-E-A-T. And I owe credit to Christian apologist Hank Hanegraaff for coming up with this very clever memorization tool. So each letter stands for a different point. F stands for fatal execution, E stands for empty tomb, A stands for appearances, and T stands for transformed lives. And you can remember this word feat because if Jesus really did rise from the dead, it's the greatest feat ever accomplished by anyone. So F-E-A-T. So let's go ahead and look at that first fact, the fatal execution. The majority of New Testament historians agree that Jesus did die on the Roman cross. The first question that might come up is, why does this matter? You know, for a skeptic, they might say, you know, the only certainty in life is death. Or, you know, how's it go? The only certainty in life is death and taxes, but some people get out of paying taxes one way or the other. So, you know, the only certainty in life is death. So, if he didn't die on the cross, he probably died later, you know, what does it matter? Well, if everyone thinks you're dead, but you're not really dead, it's going to be easy to fake a resurrection. Right? So it is important to establish that he did die on the cross. So why do the majority of New Testament historians agree on this fact? Well, first we have multiple sources. We have multiple witnesses. We have Matthew. We have Luke. We have Matthew. We have Mark. We have Luke. We have John. And we have Luke writing in Acts. And it's mentioned in several of the letters written by Paul. Now, another question that might come up at this point is, wait, why are you talking about Paul? I thought he became a follower of Christ later. He comes into the story later. So why would you even mention him? We don't even know if he was at the crucifixion. Well, we mention him because many critical scholars agree that some of Paul's letters are the earliest sources that we have. Even critical scholars are willing to admit that many of Paul's letters are some of the earliest sources that we have. But also, he was right there in that community. He was in that region at that time, so he's in a good place to know whether or not these things actually happened. So we're using Paul as well. Now, another question that might come up is, you know, you mentioned Matthew, Mark, and Luke, like as if these are 3 separate sources. But really, there's a reason why these are called the Synoptic Gospels. They're called the Synoptic Gospels because there are similarities between those 3 Gospels. And so the skeptic will say, in fact, it looks like Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark. So it looks like Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark. And in fact, it looks like there may have even been borrowing in multiple directions between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it is true that when we look at the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, they do mention some of the same details that Mark mentions. And sometimes they even list those details in the same order as Mark. And in some cases, they even use the exact same wording as Mark. So it does look like Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark. Actually, I think there's a better explanation, but the majority view is that they borrowed. Okay, so sure. Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark. But what I want you to understand is that when it comes to the resurrection accounts and the passion narratives, each of these authors provide their own unique details from their own unique perspective. So we still have good reason to think that they represent 3 separate sources. But for the sake of argument this evening, we'll just assume, sure, we'll just say they borrowed and they don't count as 3 independent sources. We'll count them as 1. Still, we have multiple sources with each one of these facts. Now, one other question that may come up is, okay, so you've got multiple sources, but how do you know they're not all just taking the word of the Roman centurion? You know, the guy who takes Jesus down off the cross. You know, maybe he's taking Jesus down. He's saying, yep, this guy's dead. And they all overheard that. They agree, okay, yep, he's dead. They're just taking his word for it. So why should we believe the word of the Roman centurion? Well, we don't have to think that, we don't have to require that the Roman soldier, you know, was like an MD or that, you know, he was a licensed coroner or something like that. Because Roman soldiers were professional executioners. They were professional executioners. The Roman government had perfected, as sick as that is, perfected the practice of crucifixion over many years, in fact, centuries. And they were using it regularly as a political tactic, as a political tool to control the people that they had conquered. And so the Roman soldiers were professional executioners. But beside that, there's another reason why we can know that Jesus really did die on the cross. And that is, it looks like medically and historically, you can't fake death by crucifixion. Medically, it looks like you can't fake death by crucifixion. Most people think that the crucifixion victim dies through blood loss, right? That's what most people would think. But actually, it looks like medically, crucifixion was not intended to kill through blood loss. Instead, it was intended to kill through asphyxiation, basically suffocation. Because as someone is hanging on the cross, as they're hanging by their arms, they can breathe in, but it looks like medically they wouldn't be able to breathe back out. Well, we know, through medical, we know medically that anatomically that the longest someone's going to be able to survive being able to breathe in but not back out is 12 minutes. That's the longest someone will be able to survive. Now, that doesn't make sense because Jesus was on the cross longer than 12 minutes. In fact, crucifixion victims regularly lasted many hours. So why would we say that they could only last 12 minutes? Well, what the crucifixion victim then has to do is they have to pull up on the nails in their wrists and push down on the nails in their feet in order to rise up, take a breath, and slump back down. And so it draws out this agonizing process of suffocation over many hours. It's actually an ingenious but a very sick form of execution. And actually, this explanation, this medical explanation, makes sense of why the Roman soldiers broke the legs of the two criminals being crucified on either side of Jesus. Remember in John, it says these guys are taking too long to die, we got to get them down off the cross. So the Roman soldiers said, okay, we'll break their legs. Why would they break their legs? What does that have to do with crucifixion? Well, now they can no longer push up, and now they can no longer rise up and take a breath, and so they're going to suffocate a lot faster. So, given what we now understand medically and historically, it looks like there would only be two ways to try to fake death by crucifixion. And I wouldn't recommend either one of them. The only two ways to try to fake death by crucifixion, it looks like, would be, well, first you could try to continually push up and take a breath, and you slump back down like you're dead. And then before 12 minutes is up, you push yourself back up, take a breath, and slump back down. And then before 12 minutes is up, you do it again, and you just keep doing this. So I don't think you're going to fool anyone, right? You're moving, right? I don't think anyone's going to say, hey, this moving guy's dead. I don't think that's going to fool anyone. But there's only one other way to try to fake death by crucifixion, and it's not going to work much better. The only other way to try to fake death by crucifixion would be to stay slumped down. So it's not going to be very long before you're no longer faking, right? You might fool a lot of people, but fool yourself as well, because you're not going to last very long. So it looks like you can't fake death by crucifixion, basically. Now, I say that tentatively because there are some medical experts over the years who've actually argued, no, I don't think crucifixion was intended to kill through suffocation. And they've made arguments that actually it looks like maybe someone could continue to breathe for a while they're hanging on the cross. And they instead argue that a person on the cross would die through other means. And they have, there are lists of possible causes of death. But I think even if that's true, we still have good reason to think that Jesus did die on the cross. And that's for several reasons, having to do with what happened to Jesus before he was on the cross. In your packet there, I've put some information about a reason to believe that Jesus' skin was probably very fragile before any of this even happened. And that has to do with his time in the Garden of Gethsemane. But the details are in your packet. But even setting that aside, next was the scourging. And the Roman scourging was something that was brutal. It was very brutal. In your packet there, I've put quotes from various historical sources that describe what a Roman scourging was like. And basically, they would use this flagrum, which had bits of sharp bone and steel, like metal balls, sewn into the whip. And so it was not just a whip, it was also had these sharp and metal objects on there that were intended to shred the person's back. And in fact, not just their skin, but go deeper into the deeper tissue. And so the descriptions that we have historically, and I'm sorry for the graphic details, but The descriptions that we have historically are actually even more graphic than I'm saying, and they show that a Roman scourging was incredibly brutal. In fact, it's amazing that anyone who underwent a Roman scourging, it's amazing that they even survived long enough to be crucified. So there was that. But then in addition to that, each of the Gospels describes multiple times that Jesus was beaten before going on the cross. So we have good reason to think that he did die on the cross. But in addition to that, there's still another reason that we can know that Jesus did die on the cross. And that has to do with the spear that was thrust through his side. Now, one question that comes up is, this is mentioned in John, but it's not mentioned in any of the other Gospels. So now we're back to one source. So why should we believe it? Well, we should believe it because it's incredibly medically accurate. It's incredibly medically accurate. Medical details that weren't known at that time, but fit what we've discovered recently medically. And so if you remember, in the account, it says that the soldier thrust the spear into Jesus' side, and blood and water came out. That seemed, for years, for centuries, millennia, last 2,000 years, people have tried to explain, what does that mean? Maybe it's metaphorical, maybe it's a spiritual meaning. But it actually turns out that this is very medically accurate. It turns out in the particular situation that Jesus was in, having been on the cross for the period of time that he was on the cross, and having recently died, as it says, the pericardium, which is the sac around the heart, would fill with a clear water-like fluid. And even his lungs likely would fill with a clear water-like fluid. And so when the spear was thrust in his side, it would look like blood and water separately coming out. In fact, this summer, when I was doing my classes at Biola in California, one of my classmates is actually a cardiologist. He's a heart surgeon. And so I said, hey, this is a cool opportunity. I can ask him about this. So I said, hey, I've read these papers that say that this is medically accurate and that it would look like blood and water coming out. And he said, oh yeah, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, in the situation that Jesus was in, it's exactly what we would expect. So it turns out this is very medically accurate. So it's because of evidence like this that in 1986, an article was published in one of the most prestigious medical journals in the United States, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And here's how they concluded their paper. Quote, clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear, thrust between his right rib, probably perforated not only the right lung, but also the pericardium and heart, thereby ensuring his death. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. So we can know historically that Jesus did die on the cross. Okay, next fact, E, empty tomb. Why do the majority of New Testament historians agree that Jesus' tomb was found empty? Well, again, we have multiple sources. We have Matthew, we have Mark, we have Luke, we have John, and it's implied by Luke in Acts, and it's implied in 2 of the letters written by Paul. But beside that, there are 3 other reasons that we can know that Jesus' tomb was found empty. And to help us remember these 3 reasons, we're going to use another memorization tool. We're going to use the word saw, S-A-W. And you can remember this word saw because as you read the accounts of the empty tomb, you keep reading about how various disciples run to the tomb and they look in and they saw that it was empty. One right after another, they run to the tomb, they look in, they saw that it was empty. The women followers run to the tomb, look in. The male disciples run to the tomb, they look in, they saw that it was empty. How do we know that they saw an empty tomb? Well, there are 3 reasons. S stands for stolen body. And this reminds us that in the New Testament and sources outside the New Testament, we see that the earliest Jewish response to the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead was to say, well, the disciples must have stolen the body. The disciples must have, think about that. The disciples must have stolen the body. Well, that's saying that the tomb is empty, right? That's coming up with a reason or an excuse, if you will, for an empty tomb. If Jesus' tomb wasn't empty, they wouldn't say the disciples stole the body. They would say, well, there's the body right there. What do you mean he's risen from the dead? He's right there. Instead, they say that the tomb was empty. Now, or that the body was stolen. Now, at this point, you might think, okay, but now you just dug a big hole for yourself. Because now you have to explain how we know that the disciples didn't steal the body. Well, in response to that, I am going to punt the answer to that to the end of the presentation. Because right now, my job is just to establish that the tomb was found empty. We're not concerned about explaining how the tomb became empty. We're just establishing that we know historically that the tomb was found empty. Okay, the next fact that we remember is A, as in Arimathea. A stands for Arimathea, as in Joseph of Arimathea. And this reminds us that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And why should we believe this? Well, again, we have multiple sources, which I've listed there for you. But beside that, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin, the very council that had condemned Jesus to death. In fact, not just to death, but had insisted on the very brutal form of execution that he went through. If you look at the accounts, they insist on crucifixion. Now, given that the early Christians were, literally despised the Sanhedrin for what they had done, someone making up this story, if they're making it up, they wouldn't make a Sanhedrin member the hero of the story who gives Jesus an honorable burial. I mean, think about just the overall picture of what the Gospels say. Basically, they say that us disciples, when Jesus was arrested and condemned and crucified, well, we all ran. We all ran and hid. And while we're hiding behind closed doors, well, a Sanhedrin member, he had the boldness to go up to Pilate, ask for Jesus' body, give him an honorable burial, and bury him in a brand new family tomb, which was a big deal back then. It just doesn't make sense as a made-up story. Instead, a better explanation is that the gospel writers wrote down what really happened, even though it was for them a very embarrassing detail. So that's A, Arimathea. Now, one question that might come up here is, okay, so Jesus' body was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, but what does that have to do with the empty tomb? Like, how does that establish that the tomb was empty? Well, it's important for supporting the empty tomb in this way. It means that the burial site of Jesus' body was known to both Jews and Gentiles. So it simply won't do to say, well, the disciples must have gone to the wrong tomb. Or it won't do to say, well, of course Jesus' body was missing, just like all other common criminals who were crucified back then. He was just pulled down off the cross and thrown in a shallow grave where scavenging animals, sadly enough, would deal with the remains. That was pretty common back then. But no, the burial site of Jesus' body was known to both Jews and Gentiles. Okay, W stands for women followers. And that reminds us that the primary witnesses to the empty tomb was a group of Jesus' women followers. Now, it turns out this is really significant because the gospel writers simply would not have made up a story in which women were the primary witnesses to the empty tomb, because back then, a woman's testimony was considered almost completely worthless. I mean, it was a very sexist, male-dominant society. Now, this is not my view. My wife wanted to remind you that, I wanted to remind you that this is not my view, but this was the view of that society back then, that a woman's testimony was considered worthless. Now, I've put in your packet quotes from ancient sources that show that they did not consider a woman's testimony to be valuable at all. Really, there's no need to read them because you have them in your packet, but they're pretty darn funny, so I'm going to read them anyway. So here's what they say. Josephus, first, we'll start with Josephus. Now, he was a first century Jewish historian. And in this passage, he's actually describing a Jewish court of law. And here's what he says, quote, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the fickleness and the boldness of their sex." Yeah, okay, so that's Josephus. Then you have Strabo, who's a Greek historian. He was writing in the 1st century BC. And here's what he says, quote, "For in dealing with a crowd of women, a philosopher cannot influence them by reason." And he actually goes on to dig the hole deeper. I think if he was writing today, he'd be sleeping on the couch after his wife read that. Okay, then you have Celsus, who's a 2nd century Greek philosopher, and he was a strong critic of Christianity. In fact, in this quote, in this passage, he's actually responding to the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. And notice what he goes after. He goes after the fact that women are the primary witnesses. Here's what he says. He finished describing the resurrection, and then he says this, quote, "But who saw this? A hysterical female, as you say." And he actually goes on to dig the hole deeper. Now, again, my wife wanted to remind you, I wanted to remind you that this is not my view, but this was the view of that society back then. And so it doesn't make sense that they would make up this account where women are the primary witnesses. In fact, again, let's step back and look at the overall picture that the gospel writers paint. Here's basically what they're saying. After Jesus was arrested and then condemned and crucified, we all got really scared. Us disciples, we all got scared and ran and hid. And while we're hiding behind closed doors, the women, they went through the burial ground, approached the Roman guard, went into the dark cave-like tomb, and by the way, they're the primary witnesses to this entire story that we're telling you. It just doesn't make sense as a made-up story. Instead, a better explanation is that the gospel writers wrote down what really happened, even though it was for them a very embarrassing detail. In fact, it's because of this evidence that Dr. Bart Ehrman agrees that the tomb was found empty. Now, Dr. Ehrman is a world-renowned New Testament scholar and a YouTube yodeling sensation, so that's pretty cool. But I don't actually know that that's true. But one thing I do know that's true is that he's very critical of biblical Christianity. In fact, he's made a whole career out of criticizing, or actually I think a more accurate word would be attacking Christianity through a series of books. He's written a whole series of books that attack Christianity, or at least strongly criticize Christianity. But listen to what he says after looking at the evidence. He says, quote, "We also have solid traditions to indicate that women found the tomb empty 3 days later. This is attested in all of our gospel sources, early and late, and so it appears to be in historical data." That means historical bedrock. This is something we can count on historically. So, when we use the tools of the historian, we can know that Jesus' tomb was found empty. And it's because of all this evidence put together that the secular historian, Michael Grant, said, quote, "If we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary source, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty." Okay, so we've covered F, fatal execution, and E, empty tomb. Now let's look at A, the appearances. The majority of New Testament historians agree that different people, and even groups of people, on separate occasions, under a variety of circumstances, all experienced appearances of the risen Jesus. So why do the majority of historians agree on this fact? Well, again, we have multiple sources. The appearance to Peter is described in Luke, and it's described by Paul. The appearance to the 11 apostles is described by Matthew, by Luke, by John, and by Luke again in Acts, and is described by Paul again. The appearance to the women is described by Matthew and by John, and the appearance to Paul himself is described by Acts, by Luke in Acts, and also by Paul himself in 1 Corinthians. So take all of those witnesses, and then add to that an additional 500, over 500 more witnesses, because that's what it describes in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, we're back to one source, because these 500 witnesses, or over 500 witnesses, are only described in this one source. But let's read the account, and I think it'll become clear why we can trust that these 500 people really did see the risen Jesus. Here's what it says, quote, "After that, he," that is Jesus, "appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some had fallen asleep." Fallen asleep. That's a nice way of saying they've, kicked the bucket. But, did you catch the detail just before that? He said most of them are still living. And he's writing to the church in Corinth, people who are in a position where they can actually look into this. He's telling them, hey, most of these people are still around. You can go and interview them yourself. He's essentially daring them to go and check his sources. Now, I don't think if Paul was making this up, he would be daring them to go check his sources. In fact, it's kind of like this handout here. I put a lot of sources in there, but not only did I put the sources, I put the exact name of it, the exact name of the author, the publisher, and the exact page number to the date that it was published, and the page number where you can find the information. Now, if I was making all of these sources up, would I really put all of that information in there, essentially daring you to go check the sources? No. At least we don't have good reason to think that it would be falsified. Now, it is true that there are occasions where people will falsify footnotes, in a paper or something like that. But, first of all, I'm drawing attention to it like Paul was doing, so that's usually not smart if you're going to fake that kind of stuff. But also, most of the time, it does turn out they're keeping themselves accountable by putting all that information in there. In fact, usually if someone's going to falsify a source, they might bury one or two false sources in with a bunch of other sources that are legitimate. And so, so here, the idea that he's making up all 500 of these witnesses is just not accurate. In fact, not likely, especially since it was all at the same time. Jesus appeared to them all at the same time. I think we have good reason to trust that these people did in fact see Jesus. So between the over 500 witnesses and the various disciples who saw Jesus, we have an incredible number of witnesses to the risen Jesus. So we've covered F, fatal execution. We've covered E, empty tomb. We've covered the appearances. Last, let's look at T, the transformed lives of the disciples and even enemies of Christ. Why do the majority of New Testament historians agree that the disciples and even enemies of Jesus, that their lives were radically transformed following this alleged resurrection? Well, we're going to have to look at it in two steps, right? Because we'll have to look at their lives before the resurrection, what was that like, and then look at their lives after the resurrection. Well, before the resurrection, the apostles were scattered and hiding in fear. We know this from multiple sources. We know this from Matthew, and from Mark, and from Luke, and from John. But besides that evidence, there's still another reason that we can know that this is true. And that is that it's just plain embarrassing. I mean, again, let's step back and look at the overall picture of what they're saying. They're saying that their leader clearly told them, I am going to die, and 3 days later I'm going to rise from the dead. But when he's arrested and crucified, the disciples, they all run and hide, and instead of waiting for him there when he rises from the dead, instead they're hiding behind closed doors. And when Jesus appears to them, all of them are shocked. All of them are surprised to see him. So this is incredibly embarrassing, and these are supposed to be the leaders of the movement. These are the leaders that survived Jesus, who went on to start the church. It just doesn't make sense that the leaders of this movement would be depicted in such an embarrassing light if it's a made-up story. Okay, so that's before the resurrection. They're hiding and they're scattered and they're in fear. What about after the resurrection? Well, after the resurrection, these same apostles are publicly proclaiming the gospel message and the resurrection of Jesus to the very people who had weeks earlier crucified Jesus. All of a sudden, they're very bold, and they continue to proclaim the gospel message and the resurrection to an incredibly hostile society. In fact, we have good reason to think historically that several of the apostles were actually tortured and killed for their belief. They're willing to undergo torture and death for this proclamation that they're making. And to support this, we actually have an incredible resource that's been just written within the last couple of years. This book, The Fate of the Apostles. Now, those of you who know that I've been taking this class on the evidence for the resurrection over the last year, some of you may know that my professor for the class is actually Sean McDowell, the author of the book. Now, you might recognize the last name McDowell because he's actually the son of Josh McDowell, who has written several books on the evidence for the resurrection and the evidence for Christianity. Well, Sean McDowell, he did this thorough study of the historical sources when it comes to each and every one of the apostles. He goes through every single apostle and studies each of the relevant historical sources to see what can we learn historically about what happened to each of the apostles. And so I'll read for you the conclusion here. He says, quote, "We have convincing evidence that Peter, Paul, James the son of Zebedee, James the brother of our Lord, and James the brother of our Lord, all died as martyrs. It is more probable than not that Thomas also died as a martyr." In fact, he goes on, he says, quote, "The critical point is not that we might establish the martyrdom of all of the apostles. Rather, it's their willingness to suffer and die for their first-hand witness of the risen Jesus. This is of foremost importance. The evidence shows that some really died as martyrs and that none recanted." And so, after a thorough historical study, we can know that at least 4 of the apostles did suffer and die, and actually 5 of them, really, we have good reason to think that at least 5 of them suffered and died for this proclamation. Now, if they were just making these stories up, if they were making the resurrection up, then they wouldn't be willing to die for their very own lie. Some people say a person won't die for a lie. Well, that's not exactly true, because we can think of examples where people will die for what they believe is true, but turns out to be a lie. But if the apostles are the ones that are supposedly making up this whole story, and they wouldn't be willing to die for their very own lie. They know what happened to Jesus, and they're the ones who are claiming that he rose from the dead. They wouldn't be willing to die for their very own lie. In addition to that, there was another transformation that the disciples and even the enemies of Jesus underwent, people like Paul and James. And that is, they claimed to believe in the resurrection despite many cultural reasons not to believe in the resurrection. Jewish society at that time, and really any time before that, had no concept of a dying or even rising Messiah. There was just no concept of the Messiah dying, and especially there was no concept in Jewish thought of a person rising from the dead before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Yet, even though these ideas are very foreign to them, that a Messiah would actually die and then rise from the dead and all that, they came to believe in that despite being raised with opposite ideas. And so it's a very foreign idea in that culture. So, using the tools of the historian, we can establish 4 facts relating to the resurrection. We can establish that Jesus did die on the Roman cross. We can establish that his tomb was found empty on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. We can establish that the disciples and others did experience appearances of the risen Jesus. And we can establish that the lives of the disciples and even enemies of Jesus were radically transformed after this alleged resurrection. So, what best explains these 4 facts? Well, there have been many theories proposed. In fact, we don't have time to cover all of the theories. I've put in your packet there a list of many of the popular theories that have been proposed. In fact, I have a few of them up here, but we're just going to cover 2 of them real quick. 2 of the most popular theories that have been proposed. The first one is the hallucination theory. Maybe the disciples just hallucinated these appearances. They'll say the disciples had really dedicated their life to following Jesus, and they had really invested so much in him and gotten close to him, and then they saw him brutally executed. It was very brutal and very very crushing for them. And so they began hallucinating these appearances of Jesus. Well, let's see how well it accounts for the 4 facts. Does it explain the fatal execution? Yeah, that was the traumatic event that's supposed to cause the hallucinations. Okay, so it does explain that. What about the empty tomb? Does it explain the empty tomb? No, it doesn't explain the empty tomb at all. If the disciples are going around saying that Jesus had risen from the dead, and we know that the Roman and the Jewish authorities wanted very badly to stop this early movement, especially the Sadducees who didn't even believe in resurrection, then they would just point to the body and say, well, no, there's this body right there. But instead, we see that the tomb was empty, and so it doesn't explain the empty tomb. What about the appearances? Does it explain the appearances? Well, it's supposed to, right? That's the whole point of the hallucination theory. Except these appearances were to multiple people, not just as individuals, but entire groups of people in many locations under different circumstances. Now, a psychologist is going to have a hard time explaining how several individuals all experience the same hallucination. The psychologist is going to have an even harder time explaining how they experience these same hallucinations when they were in different locations under different circumstances. And basically, the psychologist is going to have a very difficult time explaining how an entire group of people all experience the same hallucination at the same time. And it turns out that's the nail in the coffin, if you will, for the hallucination theory. Last, does it explain the transformed lives? Well, it's actually a pretty weak explanation for the transformed lives, and it gets technical. Hallucinations don't typically cause lasting changes in someone's life. But for the sake of argument, let's say, sure, it explains the transformed lives. It wouldn't explain someone like Paul, though, who didn't even want Jesus to rise from the dead and wasn't a follower of Jesus. But for the sake of argument, still, at best, it explains only 2 out of the 4 facts. That's a failing grade. The next explanation that we'll look at, the last one, is the explanation that the disciples stole the body. Did the disciples steal the body? Well, let's see how well it accounts for our 4 facts.
Have dessert after you're done.
Okay, thank you. Does it explain F, the fatal execution? Well, yeah, I mean, that's why Jesus' body was in the tomb, to be stolen. Okay. Does it explain the empty tomb? Well, it's supposed to explain the empty tomb, right? The disciples stole the body. But it doesn't explain, if the disciples steal the body and then make up the story, why would they make women the primary witnesses to this story? It just doesn't make sense. They've just undermined the credibility of their entire story. What about A, the appearances? Does it explain the appearances? No. It doesn't explain the appearances at all. Well, actually, no, sorry. There is one way to explain the appearances on the stolen body hypothesis. And that is the Weekend at Bernie's scenario. How many of you saw Weekend at Bernie's? Oh, yeah, you know, they take this dead guy, and they string him up by his arms and his legs, and they put sunglasses and a hat on him, and parade him out around town. And everyone thinks he's alive, but he's actually dead. I don't think that's ever going to make it as a true historical theory, as a credible historical theory, so we won't worry about that one too much. What about T, the transformed lives of the disciples? It doesn't explain the transformed lives of the disciples at all, because they're the ones who stole the body. They're the ones who are making up the story. They wouldn't be willing to die for their very own lie. And in fact, they had nothing to gain by making it look like Jesus rose from the dead. The only thing they gained from it is persecution, torture and death and execution. So each of these other naturalistic theories fail as well. It turns out that the only adequate explanation for all four facts that we've established is that God raised Jesus from the dead. It explains all four facts. It explains the fatal execution because Jesus really did die on the cross. It explains the empty tomb because Jesus' tomb was really left empty because he left it behind. It explains the appearances because Jesus really did appear to these disciples and even enemies of Jesus. And it explains the transformed lives of the disciples and even the enemies of Jesus because they witnessed the greatest miracle that anyone has ever seen. So it explains all four of the facts. So what we've covered here tonight is a very simple argument. We don't have to assume that the Bible is a message from God. We don't even have to assume that the Bible is even just generally historically reliable. Simply taking the Bible as a collection of ancient writings, which it clearly is, we can establish four facts that are best explained by the conclusion God raised Jesus from the dead. And we can remember these four facts by remembering that if Jesus really did rise from the dead, it's the greatest feat ever accomplished by anyone. F-E-A-T. Fatal execution, empty tomb, appearances, and transformed lives. So you have the tools now. You have the tools so that tomorrow you could go and tell someone about the evidence for the resurrection. You can explain to someone how they can know that Jesus really did rise from the dead. And we should use every opportunity we get. Every chance we get to tell people that Jesus really did rise from the dead, we should take advantage of those opportunities because what we've just established historically has huge implications for everyone. The first implication is it means that Jesus was telling the truth. Jesus was telling the truth. He claimed to be the unique messenger of God. He claimed to be the only way to God. He claimed to be God himself. Now, if it turns out Jesus was just lying, or if he was crazy or whatever, if he really wasn't the unique messenger of God, the only way to God, and God himself, then let's face it, Jesus was a heretic. It means he was a heretic. Now, I don't think God would be too pleased about someone going around claiming to be his unique messenger and the only way to him, and God himself, if it's not actually true. So, if this heretic says, I'm going to prove that I am all these things, I'm going to die, and 3 days later I'm going to rise from the dead, is God going to raise him? No. God wouldn't raise a heretic like that, especially if he's saying, this is how I'm going to prove that I'm all these things. It also means, another implication is that Christianity is not just some myth. Christianity is based on a real historical event in which God came down to earth to live among us. Now, this is not some deistic God who creates everything and then just walks away. This is a God who's intimately involved in humanity. Now, another important implication is it means that God loved us so much that he was willing to take on the punishment for all the wrong things that all of us have ever done. I mean, imagine the type of punishment that would accrue from all the wrong thoughts and all the wrong actions of every person who has ever lived. Well, the torture and crucifixion that Jesus went through was that level of punishment. It was excruciating. In fact, many of you, I don't know how many of you realize, but the word excruciating comes from the word for cross. because we had to invent a word for how much suffering the cross and crucifixion caused. And by the way, for those who may think that Mel Gibson exaggerated the suffering of Jesus in his movie Passion of the Christ, you really ought to look into it medically and historically, because it turns out it really was that bad. Now, there's another implication from this evidence, and that is it helps us realize that during whatever suffering we go through here in this life, God is not just someone who stands coldly by and watches us suffer. Instead, God is someone who entered into this world of suffering and endured the ultimate suffering on our behalf. And there's one last great implication from the evidence that we just covered. And that is, Jesus claimed to be the only way to receive God's forgiveness. And that claim has been validated. And this is such a serious issue with such serious implications that the New Testament states or clearly implies over 100 times that accepting Jesus' sacrifice is the only way to receive God's pardon. In fact, I have here with me a little booklet that's produced by Stand to Reason, which some of you have heard of. It's a great organization, Stand to Reason. But it lists over 100 verses that clearly state or strongly imply that accepting Jesus' sacrifice is the only way to receive God's forgiveness. Do we realize what this means? That means that every day we're surrounded by people who are going to be eternally separated from God because they haven't put their trust in Jesus' sacrifice. Sadly, many people in our society have been falsely taught that the resurrection is just a myth. What are we doing to clear away these false ideas that are hindering people from confronting the truth of the gospel? Remember earlier I said the only certainty in life is death. We're working toward a deadline, literally. So I urge you guys to begin telling people about how they can know that the resurrection really happened and how they can receive God's free gift of salvation. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you.